It's bigger than biotech.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of It's Bigger Than Biotech. Today's guest is someone whose journey bridges pharmacy, data science, and cutting edge biotech. Engie Salama is the Associate Director of Clinical Pharmacology and Pharmacometrics at Xencor, where she's helping bridge and shape the future of oncology drug development through dose optimization and translational strategy. Her story is one of deep curiosity, bold pivots, and the mindset required to turn uncertainty into impact. And we're beyond excited to have her on the show. Welcome to It's Bigger Than Biotech, the podcast where we dive into real stories behind careers in biotech, pharma, and life sciences, helping students and young professionals navigate what's next. I'm your host, Hriday Gondalia, and today's conversation is one you won't want to miss.
So, could you describe your role as the Associate Director of Clinical Pharmacology and Pharmacometrics at Xencor? And what does your day look like, and how does your role contribute to the development of biospecific monoclonal antibodies for cancer treatment?
Sure. So the simplest way I like to describe what a clinical pharmacologist does is we're in charge of the dose, right?
Okay.
So whether that's translating from animal data into humans, what is the first dose we should study in humans? So that's your first in human determination through dose escalation and then ultimately your phase 2 and phase 3 studies. What is a dose that is both safe and efficacious? So pharmacometrics is basically the computational field that supports the analyses in order to make those strategic decisions, which is the clinical pharmacology component. And in terms of what my day to day looks like, it's a lot of meetings, but it's also a lot of time dedicated to analysis. So whether that's analyzing data from animals or from humans. Additionally, doing exposure response analyses. So basically bridging the gap between how much drug we saw in the patient to what are the effects that we're seeing, whether that's toxicity from a safety perspective or response from an efficacy perspective, right? So in oncology, it's a tumor shrinkage, right? That's the simplest way you can think about it, or biomarkers that might be changing depending on the type of cancer. Yeah, so that's a little bit about what I do. And like I said, a lot of my time is in meetings, but also I have to spend time doing research in the indications that I work in, right? What does the landscape look like in the different types of cancers that I'm supporting and what is currently on the market, right? So there is a lot of biotech acumen that goes into it as well that you develop with having experience, right? It's not something that you just have coming out of school. It's something that you learn on the job.
Right. And this seems like a very specific role. It's very niche, I'd say. So how did you find out about this role in the first place?
It's a great question. It definitely is a very niche role, but I'm very happy that it's a niche role because it means I'll always have a job. I actually just happened to stumble into it. So between my first and second year of pharmacy school, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to do an internship at Allergan, which got acquired by AbbVie. And so I did that summer internship and it just happened to be in clinical pharmacology. I was like very open to anything. I was like, whatever they give me, I'll be thankful for. And so that's how I was exposed to what this field is. To be honest, during the internship, I didn't really do anything related to what I do now. It was a lot of literature search and a lot of like looking at the landscape for psoriasis, which is what Allergan was interested in at the time. So that was my first exposure to it, but I didn't really learn the skills and like what it means to be a clinical pharmacologist until my postgraduate experiences. So after I finished pharmacy school and did a postdoctoral fellowship in the field of clinical pharmacology. But that's how I had an inkling of like, oh, this is really cool and very like unique. And I think this is what I'd like to do once I graduate from pharmacy school.
Right. And so, like you mentioned, you've had several experiences with drug development over your career. So, how has your perspective on drug development evolved from your time as principal scientist to your current associate director position at Xencor?
Yeah, so in the principal scientist role, I felt like it was very much just an individual contributor role, and I didn't have to think too much about the strategy pieces of it. It was more like, okay, do this analysis, figure out this question, what are the scientific insights we can get from this data? But now, as an associate director, first of all, I have to be a lot more independent and I have to start asking those questions myself. And I have to do the research myself and also figure out what questions should I be asking, right? As opposed to just being told, oh, I need you to do this analysis.
Right. Right. And so your role spans both strategy and the science. And I know a lot of students, or maybe not a lot, but I'm sure students have an inkling that they also want to do both in the field. And so my question to you was, do you only experience both strategy and science when you're higher up in the corporate ladder, or is it also possible to get this at a position at a junior level in a company?
I think ultimately it's very much self driven. At the end of the day, if you're the kind of person who wants to make impacts on decision making and you're doing the research and figuring out the questions that are helpful for making those strategic decisions, then by all means. I think also having the support of your manager, even if you are more junior, and convincing them that you have a compelling argument goes a long way in terms of actually making an impact from a strategic perspective. So I think that mentorship piece is also very key, having somebody who will listen to your opinion. And sometimes they'll poke holes in it, right? And show you where maybe your logic is flawed or where you need to do a little bit more digging in order to figure out the true answer, quote unquote. Although with science, we can only answer as much as we think we know, but in very complex areas like immunology, right? For everything we know about the immune system, there are 10 other things we don't know. And so a lot of science is just having a hypothesis, right? Seeing what evidence supports it and seeing what disproves it and refining those hypotheses as you continually pressure test it.
I see. And that's a very nice way to put it. But one thing that makes me curious about is that you have a background in pharmacy. Technically, you wanted to go to pharmacy school, right? Right after university. And so, what inspired this specialized career path in the first place? Like, what made you pivot your strategy? And second, how do you feel your pharmacy background enhances your current work?
Absolutely. So I actually went into pharmacy school knowing that I would not be a pharmacist.
Wow.
Which is very unusual. I mean, I wanted to do it for the safety of it. And, obviously, if God forbid anything happened, I could always potentially have a job working as a pharmacist. But I knew very early on that as much as I enjoyed patient care, it wasn't where I saw myself. So even though I'd made the decision to go to pharmacy school very early, I also knew that I wanted to do something a little bit different. And initially, I actually was more interested in academia and kind of like the more scientific inquiry aspect of things. But doing that internship between my first and second year of pharmacy school is what got me started about thinking about industry or, biotech, pharma in general. And honestly, I do think that my experience in pharmacy school is very relevant and actually very helpful because a lot of people in my field are PhD scientists, which obviously has a huge value, but I have a more clinical training and background, right? So thinking about like the patients and the endpoints and, designing the clinical trials and all of that aspect and kind of the more pathophysiological aspect as opposed to just like the basic biology, I think also can be really helpful. And I think there are pathways for both, whether you're trained as a PharmD or trained as a PhD or trained even as an MD. There are ways to work in the biotech industry. And I don't think the degree you have necessarily limits you.
Okay. And honestly, I've heard a lot of different things from different guests.
Sure.
And a lot of guests say that PhD trains you to ask the right questions, whereas a master's degree may help you get into the industry and get accustomed to industry. It's not about the questions, more so about the process, right? So one thing I wanted to ask you was, did you ever feel disadvantaged when you came in with a PharmD versus someone else came in with a PhD?
That's a really good question. I think my postdoctoral fellowship training, which was 2 years after my PharmD, set me up really well for my job. So another thing is during pharmacy school, I actually did work on a research project. So it's not like I was 100% clinical all the time. I actually gave up some clinical rotations so that I could work on a research question. Obviously, there's no way it could ever be as extensive as a PhD, but I think that aspect to my training also helped me. So I don't feel like I was necessarily at a disadvantage, even though I have a different degree. And like I said, in my field, there are plenty of PharmDs with postdoctoral training, and there are PhDs. Like there are valid pathways to get to the same destination. And I think ultimately it just comes down to the person and how motivated you are to get into the field that you're interested in and how much work you're willing to put in. And I think the networking aspect, so yes, your degree is important, but the networking aspect is almost even more important.
So I know like it's definitely a lot of work to get into industry, but is there a path of least resistance or like a lazy path, almost like relatively lazy path you can take to get into industry the quickest and with the most amount of like seniority maybe?
I think ultimately it just comes down to A, knowing as soon as possible you want to get into the industry, and then B, getting the experience as soon as you can. So if you are one of the privileged few who are still an undergrad and are able to work at like a biotech company or a pharma company, that's already a huge advantage. And at the end of the day, when looking at resumes, like, you know, generally companies are going to prefer somebody who has that industry experience or that direct experience in the field that they're hiring for. So I don't know if there's like a lazy way or a shortcut way, because the reality is you have to work hard for the things that you want. But my advice is definitely focus on getting industry experience as much as you can. And in the absence of that, if you're not able to get industry experience, at least work in research that is highly relevant to the area of biotech or pharma that you would like to work in. So getting translational skills that will easily make it a smoother transition for you.
I feel like honestly it's easier said than done because usually it's very tough to figure out what you want to do in the first place. That's like the biggest part of the puzzle that most people aren't able to figure out like earlier in their days. So what were some questions you had that were very important that really helped you figure out what you wanted to do?
I think knowing yourself first and foremost, and knowing what you enjoy and what you find fulfilling. Like for me personally, I really enjoy, and I was surprised by this because I actually consider myself to be a very social person who generally wants to like just talk to people and hang out with people all the time. But I actually found myself that I really enjoyed the data analysis piece and I really enjoyed the digging into it. But I think where my personality actually really helps me with my job is communicating that message and communicating why it's important, right? Because you can have the best model in the world, but if I can't explain to stakeholders what it means and why it's important, then it's as if I hadn't done that work at all. So in terms of figuring out what you want to do, I think the self-knowledge piece is really important. And as I mentioned before, the networking piece and talking to people who are doing the things that you're interested in to really get a sense of, is this something I could see myself doing, right? And so, yeah, I think those are the key pieces: knowing yourself and knowing others, so that you can understand whether you would want to be in their position, basically.
Definitely. And you mentioned that communication of ideas was a big aspect of biotech and that field in general. And I know, some universities train us just for the science. It's not more so about the communication. It's all written communication, but not verbal sometimes. And when you have highly specific knowledge, like how do you explain a bispecific antibody to someone, right? Those sort of things are not taught very well, or at least are starting to be taught. They're not like, so how do you, like, what skill sets do you say when you're recruiting are the most important to look at, or what do you look at in potential candidates?
I think people really underestimate the importance of soft skills and that communication piece that I mentioned. So, for example, the seminar presentation can really make or break whether we think a candidate is a good fit or not, right? Because the seminar is all about communicating the science and communicating the impact of the work that you've done in the past, right? At the end of the day, that maybe it didn't go anywhere, but if you can create a compelling story around how you designed your experiment or what information you were trying to get out of it, I think that can go a really long way. And we've interviewed candidates who seem really promising on paper, but unfortunately, their communication skills were just not up to par, or we didn't feel like they really conveyed that depth of knowledge that we knew they had based on their resume, right? And so I think the social aspects of it can often be underestimated. And it's a skill, right? Like you can already be a very easy to talk to person, but communicating science can be challenging. The more complex it is, right, the more difficult it can be to communicate. And so working on it and practicing it and trying to explain it to somebody who has no background in it can really help you refine your message and figure out, okay, how could I express this better?
Definitely, definitely. And in terms of looking at different candidates, I know in terms of skills, it's very different for each candidate. Some candidates might have a lot of research under their belt, must have worked at a reputable lab. But in the field, if you want to go into science specific, do you need to have research under your belt, or can you come in without any research and still get the job?
Yeah, there are people who pivot into therapeutic areas, for example, that they have no experience in, right?
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily have the research, but they do have experience in another area, or they show that they have a strong understanding of the scientific process, or they have the skills to do basic pharmacokinetic modeling, right? But it's just they haven't done it in this particular indication, right? So as long as the skills are there and the communication skills, and also I think people also really underestimate how being trainable and being somebody who is open to growing and improving, right? Nobody's perfect. Nobody has all the skills, right? But just showing that you're a team player and that you're someone who has that growth mindset can go really far.
I see. So I guess this is more of a personal question. I've worked on very little research before, right? But I have done some. But I know a few of my peers have worked in very advanced, uh, on the edge research, and it's top of the line. What do recruiters prefer more? Is it more so the best research, but like maybe okay communication and not a team player? Like, is it more so personality? What? Okay, so what I'm trying to get at is what's the ratio of science versus personality you need in a person?
Yeah, ultimately it depends on the role, right? Like if it's a highly technical role or in lab role, right, where you're actually like pipetting and doing certain types of analyses, obviously they're going to prefer somebody who's done that type of analysis before. If it's more of like a project management role or something more on the business side, right, then having hard research doesn't necessarily present an advantage to you. So I think it's very role specific. But at the end of the day, if you want to work in biotech and pharma, I think having at least a solid understanding of the science, even if you haven't worked in it before, but doing your homework, right, and researching the company and knowing what's in the pipeline, right? If you just go into the interview and it's very clear that you have no idea what the company is doing, right? Why would anybody take you seriously? You couldn't even do the bare minimum of researching the company, right? On the other hand, having a very coachable personality and being somebody that people would like to work with, that does also go a long way, right? Because you can always learn the science, right? So on the other hand, somebody who seems absolutely brilliant but also seems like they'd be a pain to work with, a lot of people would pass on that unless it's like a very specialized like consulting role, for example, right, where you need that scientific knowledge to answer a certain question. Then sure, maybe you're willing to put up with somebody who's a little bit more prickly or difficult. But if it's somebody that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, most people would pick the person who has a nice personality and a decent understanding of the science versus, a brilliant person who really understands the science. And unfortunately, you'll notice a trend in general with people who are very smart, right? Unfortunately, sometimes a bit of an ego can come with that, right? And that's not necessarily a good thing. And scientists can also be highly opinionated, right? So if you can communicate your disagreement in a respectful way, right, and have tough conversations, and politely and respectfully disagree, or at least defend your position, I think that also is a really important skill. Obviously, people take things very personally and can, see it as almost an attack on their character or their intelligence if people disagree, but that's just the reality of life. And so I think managing those relationships and also the political aspect that nobody really talks about is also really, really important.
This specific answer you gave reminded me of one saying a previous guest had. He said, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know that could build a career. What are your thoughts on that statement?
I would agree with that generally. I do think that a lot of opportunities and ways to advance are often through the connections that you have. And Basil Dahiyat, our CEO at Xencor, has often mentioned that as well, right? the people that you know, and you don't know who is going to be the bridge to your next opportunity, right? And so you obviously want to maintain positive relationships with folks as much as possible. And so it could be the person sitting next to you now, it could be somebody that you meet at a conference, right? But you always want to be on your A game and be polite and respectful and show kind of the positive sides of your personality whenever you're interfacing with people, because you really don't know who you're going to be working with next. And it is a very small world, right? And so you just want to maintain those positive ties as much as possible.
Definitely. But I feel like in terms of maintaining relationships, do you feel like there is a path where you're not able to please everyone? There's situations like that. So
Sure.
how do you deal with those kind of situations within a company when you know people you have to work with every day might get disappointed? How do you resolve those conflicts?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, a lot of it does come to compromise. And I mean, it's impossible to make everybody happy, especially if they have two diametrically opposed, opinions or positions. But having those hallway conversations and just interfacing people in a personal way on a day-to-day basis, you'd be surprised at how far that can actually go, right? Because you can have scientific disagreements with somebody, but still think they're a wonderful person, right? And so even though you can't please everyone, and management is going to have their opinion of what the right path is, and you might have a slightly different perspective, but at the end of the day, you just have to try to bridge the gap as much as possible, concede things or give up certain battles, right? Because it's not worth the fight essentially at that point, and save your energy and kind of, you only have so much power in a situation, and sometimes you want to push a little bit more on something that you really strongly believe in versus something that you're like, okay, I disagree, but I'll let it go this time. You know what I mean? So again, that's the human element to working in biotech that you can't quantify, and it's nothing that's something you're going to learn in school or a book could teach you. It's just something that comes with experience, and that's, you just have to live through it to really understand it.
Definitely. I know we went slightly off topic there, but just to bring the conversation back, like, what are some common misconceptions that early career scientists have about working in pharmacometrics in general, and how do you clarify these misconceptions?
I think a common one is that I'm just a PK scientist, or I just look at PK data, right? And that's a pitfall that I definitely don't want to fall into, or that I just model the data, right? I want to make it very clear that we are responsible for determining the best dose, right? So it's that strategy piece as well as, the actual technical modeling aspect. So I think early on in your career, especially if you don't have the confidence yet, or you don't have the biotech acumen or as much experience necessarily, you might be more shy to speak up at a meeting. I certainly have experienced that, right? But then at the end of the day, it's your job, it's your responsibility. And so you have to speak up, right? And especially in a smaller company, things move really fast, right? So if you don't speak up at the time where you really needed to, right, the opportunity will pass you. And it's really hard to circle back or go back once a decision has been made, even if you might not necessarily agree with that decision. So I think, again, having manager buy-in and having somebody who will back you up and support you is really important in that regard. And, pharmacometricians are more than just modelers. Like, yes, it's a big part of our job, obviously, like from data cleaning to model building to qualifying the model and all that stuff, right? But then interpreting it is also part of our job, and communicating that is also part of our job. And so I think that's something that is really, really important for pharmacometricians and clinical pharmacologists. So, yeah.
Definitely. And I feel like specifically with students, picking the right specialization early is a big issue, right? So what is a question you wish you'd ask yourself at the start of your career? Or like how would that have changed your path or mindset?
It's a good question. I feel like I'm the type of person, and once I've made a decision on something, I follow through with it no matter what. So I made the decision very young. I was only like 14 or 15, and I was like, I'm going to go to pharmacy school. And then I got to pharmacy school, and then I was like, okay, now I'm going to go to industry. But I think, like I said, just interrogating your own personality and also preferences, and really understanding like what do I want to get out of my career, right? I knew very early on I wanted to do something meaningful, right? I wanted to do something that would ultimately help patients and, make an impact. And so in that regard, I feel very fulfilled with my current role. And I do feel like, I'm doing the best I can to make sure that we're developing new therapies for patients who really need it. But the question I think all students should really ask themselves is, if money wasn't a factor, right? What would I truly enjoy doing, right? What would I enjoy my day-to-day looking like, and what difference do I actually want to make, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, of course, we want to make good money and we want to provide for our families and all that good stuff. But to have a fulfilling career, I think you do need that aspect or element of making an impact. And so, how do you make that impact is a question you need to ask yourself.
Wow, it's a very impactful question for sure. I definitely should have asked myself that when I was starting out, but it's not too late for me at least. So I will do that after this episode. But one specific thing is, you have a lot of information now on, if you have a lot of information knowing that now where you are, you could get to it again. So let's say a student is also interested in getting into pharmacometrics. Right? What is a recommended pathway you would give to them to get to the same position you're in right now?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there are multiple pathways. The pathway I did was pharmacy school, then a postdoc fellowship, and then my first role was as a pharmacometrician. I mean, there are programs now that are just masters in pharmacometrics. I know the University of Maryland has one. And then obviously there's you could do a PhD. So I think these are all valid pathways. And I think the thing with PhDs is you have to really enjoy what you're doing, because it is a bit of a slog. It is difficult to do a PhD. And so you have to actually be motivated to do it and not just do it for the sake of doing it, right? As a means to an end. And so I would really encourage students to think deeply about that before pursuing it. And the reality is because pharmacometrics is a pretty specialized field, the reality is you probably will need a doctorate, whether that's a PharmD or a PhD. I did mention a master's program for it. But, I think there are multiple and there's some people who, just did undergrad and then, started working, but this is like 20, 30 years ago, right? So they were able to get into the field in a kind of less direct way. But nowadays, yeah, I would say either do a PharmD with a fellowship or a PhD.
Okay. And I see the industry is moving at a pretty fast pace. Even with your role is moving at a pretty fast pace with the introduction of AI. So I know the job might look very different maybe 10 years from now. So how do you recommend students stay updated with the emergence of AI? And would this change that pathway you just recommended right now?
So I think AI is going to be more of a tool. I'm personally am not really concerned with it replacing my job, because when it comes to modeling, it's not just about sure, AI can automate it and make it faster, right? But ultimately you need a human to interpret whether it's meaningful or not. And so at the end of the day, that critical thinking aspect is, not something we're ever going to get out of automation. There are things like neural networks and other applications of AI in the field of pharmacometrics, and that's very exciting, and machine learning and all of that. And I personally am still just learning about that. The reality is that needs really big data sets, right, in order to get anything meaningful out of it. And the reality is that at a small company, I just don't have access to that. And so, digging really deeply into a small data set is almost harder than applying AI to a very large data set and trying to find trends in it, right? And so it's really about training yourself how to think critically. And so that's really the skill that I would recommend students to focus on. And obviously AI is a tool in your toolbox to help in that regard. But at the end of the day, the higher education is to train you how to think critically and how to apply that when answering scientific questions.
I see. But definitely using AI will be a big part of the job as well, learning just how to use it. So a follow-up I had on that is, how essential, even without AI, is programming knowledge for pharmacometrics, especially like your skill with R,
Mhm.
um, for success in this field?
I think it's pretty important. I mean, there are some programs that are just GUI interfaces or graphical user interfaces. So you just click some buttons and can build a model that way. But the reality is that for more complicated data sets and for more complex relationships, you're going to have to learn how to write a custom model at some point. And so I do think that the programming piece is pretty critical. Especially in pharmacometrics. I think a clinical pharmacologist, I have seen clinical pharmacologists who haven't programmed a day in their lives. But I think pharmacometrics specifically, you will need to have at least some programming experience. I don't consider myself a particularly adept programmer, to be honest, but it is something that I had to learn. My first experience was with non-mem, which is a Fortran based language. You probably haven't even heard of Fortran. It's something from the 70s. So R in that regard is definitely a lot simpler. And then there are newer languages like Julia, which I also have been learning. So it's just a part of the career development and growth, right? I think actually learning languages, it's helpful because although I don't consider myself particularly adept at it or a programmer by any means, it is meaningful and helpful and also helps you think about things in different ways. And there are tons of resources online to help support that as well. And there's always going to be somebody who's a better programmer than you anyways. And so it's an opportunity for you to learn and grow.
Definitely, definitely. My last question to you is is what do you wish someone told you about the biopharmaceutical industry when you were first entering?
I wish they had told me to spend more time reading literature papers. And that's something that I'm doing now and something that my boss has really instilled in me. I think keeping up with the trends and having that biotech acumen is actually really, really helpful. Like knowing what other companies are developing similar assets to yours, right? Where are they in terms of development? What can you learn from other molecules that are similar to yours, right? It's particularly hard if you're in a completely novel area, right, where there is no prior information. But what can you learn, for example? So I work in bispecifics. What can I learn from like single target monoclonal antibodies, right? What, how are they different from small molecule drugs, right? Can these assumptions translate over into what I'm doing now with my current molecule? So I wish I had spent more time early on in digging into that. But I mean, it's something that I'm trying to do now. I'm trying to think more strategically. I'm trying to, build that biotech acumen a little bit. And actually, interestingly, Xencor added that to one of their corporate goals. Like not this past year, the year before. So it's definitely something that the company recognizes like, okay, this is something that everybody should be working on. And so, it's been a personal goal of mine to continue working in that regard. And I think attending scientific conferences really helps in that regard, right? You see what else is going on in the field. I've been to, clinical pharmacology focused ones. I've been to pharmacometrics focused ones. And it's always been a really positive experience, not just because of the networking aspect, but also just learning and seeing what else is going on in the field. What are the trends? What are people interested in? What are people talking about? And so going to a conference a year can be really, really helpful in that regard.
Definitely. I know I'm cheating by asking you one more question.
No,
but
it's okay.
I'll ask you one last question.
Last question.
Last question. It's what do you want to leave our listeners with? Like what's one thing you want to say to them before this episode is over?
Well, first of all, I think if you're interested in the biotech field, congratulations. It's a great decision. But the one thing I would want people to really contemplate and think about is, again, and this is a theme, I keep saying it, but know yourself and know what you want and know why you want to be in biotech and always have that why, because that's what's really going to push you forward and keep you motivated on the days where, that are really hard. I mean, there are some days that are really tough, but if you always focus in on the why and know why you want to be in biotech and what is motivating you. I think ultimately that's what gets you through the hard times, and also makes and is really gratifying when you achieve that thing that you've been investing so much time and effort into.
Definitely, definitely. That's a great plug for our episode on where we actually talk about finding your why.
Okay,
So that's
excellent.
absolutely great.
I had no idea, by the way.
So like, that's perfect. So yeah, thank you so much for your time again, and it's an honor to have you on It's Bigger Than Biotech.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of It's Bigger Than Biotech. A huge thank you to Engie Salama for joining us and sharing such a thoughtful look into her journey, from pharmacy to pharmacometrics, from academia to the forefront of biotech innovation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow and rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, or actually wherever you tune in. Your support helps us keep bringing in inspiring guests like Angie and sharing the insightful things that matter the most to students and professionals shaping the future of biotech. Again, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not just science, it's bigger than biotech.